I'm Sosamma Samuel-Burnett. I'm the founder and president of Global Justice, and Global is so pleased to present to you this What is Justice Roundtable discussion. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and I'm so pleased to be introducing our panelists for today. We have with us Randall Margo. Randall is an expert in public administration and economics. He's recently been an author of a new book we'll talk about later in the program, and he's also a key global commentator on issues of economics and administration globally for our organization. We also have Willard Black. Willard is the founder of Open Door Libraries, and he's also the chairman of our board of directors for Global Justice. In addition, we have Greer Newman. Greer is one of our associates at Global, and Greer is also involved with Goodwill Ministries as well as other types of programs and services around the country. Well, welcome everyone. Are you ready for our conversation?
Good morning.
Great. Well, Willard, I'm going to start with you. You are more than 80 years old. You have worked for almost those number of years in all sorts of different countries around the world, particularly in Eastern Europe and also in the Middle East. You have worked with Open Door Libraries for over 40 years. You've been in ministry for just as long. A remarkable set of experiences that you've had. Based on that breadth of experience, tell us a little bit about your perspective of biblical justice.
My perspective basically comes from the Bible and from watching what happens in these particular countries. My perspective on biblical justice is, from working behind the Iron Curtain, we have to start with just laws, but just laws start with values. And is freedom a value? Is freedom of association a value? What can we do? For example, I was in Romania, and there was a limit on how many people could meet in an apartment. And if there were more than 6 or 7 or 8 people, it had to have state approval. So if 15 of us came together, and I did clandestine teaching in that situation, we all had to arrive over a period of 30 minutes, very obscure. And then we had to all leave over a period of 45 minutes after it was over, walking down 3 flights of stairs in total dark, lest one of the neighbors would be an informer of the government. Freedom of association is a value, and you cannot have a society that thrives without it.
Great. Well, Randy, any comments, thoughts on that, or what is your perspective? You are this expert both in the public and private sector in many different ways. You also represent this broader Judeo-Christian representation of biblical justice. You know, you come from both the Jewish community and you also walk in the Christian community. Tell us your perspective on biblical justice.
Well, before I start, I just want to thank you, Sosamma, and the staff for putting this together. I think it's a great opportunity for the community and global justice to receive these on a monthly basis, and I want to just congratulate you on our inaugural event.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're part of this.
With respect to biblical justice, obviously it can go back to the moral code that was put down all the way back to the 10 Commandments. And really that moral code provided basic rules and obligations to create a moral order. And by doing so, that enabled more harmony and justice to occur throughout a community, and so that every individual or human being would have to live a life of dignity and of freedom in the best regard. One of the things that the 10 Commandments talked about was honoring, and it also talked about things that you shall not do. And so they talked about honoring God, honoring your mother and father, and things of that nature. And then they talked about things that you shouldn't do, like killing, adultery, stealing, lying, bearing false witness, and whatever. And all this was done because there was a perception that some of the things that human beings were going back to that millennium were not going well, and that people had to live in a better relationships with one another. In order to have law and justice, I would echo what Willard said, is that you need to have that moral value or culture that precipitates or is a prerequisite for that. If you try and do that, then what you have is the culture driving what those moral values would be. And we can see that around the world today, where you find different views of what is justice. And so it might be different in the Middle East or Romania than it is here in the United States or other parts of the Western world. And so the underpinning for all of that is that Judeo-Christian moral values which create an order where you can create laws and hopefully justice.
Thank you. And now, Greer, you are a young professional and you've dedicated yourself to both biblical justice and service. How does your perspective on biblical justice vary what you've heard?
Certainly. Well, for me, when I'm working and I meet someone new and I mention to them that I'm an associate for global justice, oftentimes the word justice is confusing to people when I first meet, because the initial reaction is to say, oh, like law? That's often the reference that people come up with. And while law is a huge part of justice and serving well justice, whether in convictions or another form of justice, that's not the entire picture of justice to me. And how I like to look at it, and how I've been thinking about it lately, is we often use the phrase, well, this picture just doesn't do it justice, whether you're talking about a person or a sunset. You know, the fact of the matter is you can't say justice is only one-sided in that you're serving up justice to someone that's wrong, something that's wrongfully done. It's the bringing justice to what it's owed. So if something is beautiful, you honor it for its beauty. You serve it justice. You give it justice by, if you're taking a picture, having the proper equipment to honor the setting that you're trying to capture. And so how I like to think about this, while they were talking about Old Testament and commandments, I often think about New Testament and Christ and what justice means to him, and how when you're thinking about what's precious and what's beautiful and you're honoring it, you know, I'll stay with the example of a sunset, trying to capture it with the right equipment. Well, what was beautiful to Christ and what he laid down on the cross for was for people, for those that were weak, for those that were hungry, for those that are poor, and he granted them forgiveness by dying on the cross, by saying, it is finished, which is to me the ultimate justice, to be able to say, Christ did this for you, and so now through that we can love others the way that Christ intended, because he was the first to love. So for me, I like to look at it from the flip side. Often justice is associated with hate or revenge, whereas justice can just as much be that love.
That's great.
I'd like to pick up on what Greer just said about bringing in Christ and his responses to people and his aspirations for people and his desire to always help. Going back to the Old Testament as a background for this, if we look at justice, in the Old Testament, over and over again it speaks of justice and mercy. Mercy is always linked to the justice in the description of how God interacts with us as people. Of course, justice is, if capital punishment is the law, then if a person murders another, capital punishment is what that person should receive. But mercy says, you are still guilty, but I am withholding the punishment. In other words, you may deserve being sent to San Quentin on the death row, but at the same time, we're not going to do that. We're going to give you life imprisonment or something else of that nature. I think grace goes beyond mercy. As Christ gave grace, grace is his dying for us with no reason. In mercy, a person can still be considered guilty, but at the same time, sentence is removed. And that's quite a bit different than just grace, being declared righteous. So this comes out in a lot of different ways in our current society. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. You know, one of the central verses that we often quote is Leviticus 6:8, which talks about acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. And I think that kind of covers what you just described, Willard, about this concept of understanding what justness is, but then at the same time reconciling with both mercy and this humility, I think is really a lot like the grace you're talking about too. Randy, we have talked about sort of different forms of justice in this early part of our discussion, and biblical justice is distinct from things like criminal justice, social justice, economic justice, distributed justice, restorative justice. There's a wide range, and maybe they all fall under the umbrella of, but how do you distinguish between these different forms of justice and what we refer to as biblical justice?
When man tries to then establish some type of moral code, there are certain precepts that he uses. And so one of the things that we did here in the United States of America is that we created a foundation for that through our Bill of Rights, in which our rights were inalienable, which meant that our right to freedom of speech, to assembly, as Willard mentioned, to freedom of religion, those freedoms were basic, and they were considered to be part of what our legal structure would be like. And so in essence, that gets back to my earlier point of being able to transfer the moral underpinnings of Judeo-Christian law and to carry that into a legal justice system that provided for the freedom and liberty of every individual.
Thank you. So Greer, you talked earlier about sort of the love aspect of biblical justice compared to sort of a criminal justice perspective where you're talking about punishment. That's one way of distinguishing. How else would you distinguish between biblical justice and some of these other concepts like economic justice or social justice?
Well, while they're certainly distinguishable, I like to think of them as intermingled, because if you're a Christian and you're trying to practice and understand the concepts of biblical justice, you can't remove what we would call the secular concepts of justice and look at them separately when it comes to economic justice, or when you spoke about restorative justice, those biblical principles can come into play. And when it comes to what Willard was saying, about death penalty and the concept of mercy and restorative justice, I think that as Christians, a part of that is integrating those biblical values and saying, what would Jesus do in the simplest phrase to put it? And I think that's something that we all should look at, especially when it comes to voting. When we walk into voting booths, we have a huge election coming up, and we have a lot of different things, such as the death penalty in California coming up in 2016 to be voted on and looked at. And everyone has a different interpretation of law and right and just, and what's just to one person might not be just to another person. So the Bible becomes kind of a guidebook, a guideline to say, okay, how would Jesus apply this? How would the commandments come into play with this? And you can apply those principles to everything, justice-related, economic, social, and of course, all of that falls into biblical justice from my perspective.
Great.
One thing I would like to mention with respect to Greer's comments is that from a secular standpoint, when man moved from the biblical to the legalistic, one of the things that John Stuart Mill pointed out was that we were looking for a legal system that provided sort of the best consequences. And so bringing back, the issue of the death penalty or things of that nature, what were the best consequences for society as a whole, as well for individual justice? And that's always been sort of a issue that one has to balance in terms of the pros and cons.
I'd like to pick up on that, Randy, in terms of, let's bring David up as an example. King David was guilty of both murder and adultery, which was punishable by death under the Old Testament system. And yet, God did not implement death penalty for him. And we know that David was beneficial as a king for that society. And so God may balance what you were just talking about. I can't speak for God, but I can entertain the possibility that this may have been a situation for that.
Absolutely. As we're thinking about these concepts and definitions, there's also the application of them, right? And, there are so many issues of justice around the globe and different perspectives on what those issues require. What I'd like to do is just get your sense of a key topic, perhaps not every topic, but a key topic that you think would definitely benefit from the application of biblical justice. Maybe we'll start with you, Greer.
Certainly. Well, topics that have been in the news lately and that have been specifically relevant to me is this concept of feminism and women's rights. And I don't think most people would apply the concept of justice when they think of that initially, except for when you talk about it as in serving justice, as in what someone is owed, as in is that picture just serving justice to that person. So when you look at something like equal pay, is it just to pay women less for the same work that a man would be paid? And simply speaking, the conversation of feminism and what we're seeing today is that no, it's not just, it's not fair, it's not right, it doesn't do justice to women to value their work and contribution monetarily less than the value of their counterparts that are male.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then there is a biblical principle in that because God does love all of us. We're all made in his image, right? So valuing each individual, no matter their gender, their age, their status, would be definitely part of a biblical justice concept. Willard, what about you? What would you consider a key topic within biblical justice or within the globe today where biblical justice really would apply?
Well, I think obviously as we deal with the immigration issues within our own country, biblical justice certainly has to look into this. And then with the refugee situation as all. And as Randy talked about balance, this is one of the careful things we have to do. And I think that how we approach rights as individuals or group rights can come into play here. And that has to be worked on in ways that I'm not sure that I actually know how to do that. There's a danger in group rights, such as, shall we say, certain immigrants should be forgiven, they should receive mercy, and not have a penalty of having to be returned to their own countries. But if we do a group right, such as a sanctuary city, for example, criminals may seek that as a place where they can continue their criminal activity, which throws imbalance, as Randy pointed out. It does not benefit society, it harms society. So I think we have to look at this as how do we deal with individual rights and group rights as we work with this. And I see immigration, and I know that from being in the Middle East and some of the associations I have there, a country such as Jordan, for example, is extremely careful in vetting any of the people who cross their border from Syria, because they know, they absolutely are certain, and they have actually, I'm pretty sure, I can't say because of firsthand experience, but I've had it reported that they have executed people who come across their border as terrorists. And so therefore they're trying to balance that. It becomes very complicated.
Definitely. I mean, it's not easy. And I think part of why we want to have these conversations is to recognize that, these concepts, the application of the concepts, the principles that go behind them are not easy. It really requires us to constantly wrestle with them. So I appreciate that comment. Randy, what about you? So what's a key issue in your mind where biblical justice really applies?
Well, one of the things that I think we have to emphasize is that in many countries of the world, the ability to communicate, educate is limited. And so one of the things that we should be trying to do is to try and open up the world to new ideas, old ideas, other ways of thinking and doing things. And it gets back to Greer's point, is also Willard's as well, is that we're looking at each other as strangers, and when we do that, we don't look at each other in the best of ways. Mm. And so one of the things, you know, if you go back to biblical times, there weren't too many of these nation states. Mm-hmm. And so there were powerful rulers in certain areas, but people kind of stayed in the same place. The world is different now in terms of the global environment, where it's very easy for somebody to move from continent to continent or country to country. And so again, getting back to this balance of what are the best consequences for someone, I think what we need to do is to try and, in essence, create an environment where that freedom of communication, freedom of religion, those inalienable rights that we talked about in our own Bill of Rights become much given to all the rest of the world that perhaps don't have those same rights. And if we did that, I think what you would have then is, instead of the strangeness amongst people and cultures, you'd have a better opportunity for integration and assimilation.
Excellent. I really enjoyed all of your comments as we talked this morning, and as we're winding down our brief conversation over coffee today, I wanted to just take a moment to have each of you share a little bit. Randy, you have just put together a new book, and it really deals with economic justice issues. Could you take a moment and give us just a quick overview of what that book is all about?
Well, a couple of the themes of the book is that the nature of labor is changing now. And it's changing because of the global economy, because the demographics have changed between the Western world and the emerging countries, and also because the technology that is taking the place of a lot of labor jobs that were formerly done by people. And so how do we address those issues, and how do we address a workforce that has changed dramatically but looks like it's going to change again? One of the themes that I talk about is that up until the industrial era, over 90% of the people were self-employed. And then when the industrial era came in, today in most of the Western world, 90% of the people work for someone else. But now we're starting to see a switch in that back to people who work as independent contractors for Uber or TaskRabbit, or perhaps even they're on eBay or whatever. And so how does a regulatory workforce deal with that and deal with providing that sort of safety net for those people who aren't really employees anymore, but they're not employers either?
Great. Well, we are featuring this book on our global website, and we hope you all check that out. Willard, you have just celebrated 40 years with Open Doors Libraries. How can people learn more about Open Doors?
Well, they can go into opendoorlibraries.org and understand much about how we go about doing work. After freedom came, when communism collapsed in 1989, we had worked for 10 years behind the Iron Curtain. This opened new possibilities. So what of the things we did, since there was not freedom of the press for 50 years in Central and Eastern Europe, from the time in basically when Hitler had his first book burning in Germany in 1933, just think how long ago that happened to be. And finally in 89, this much later, they had that opportunity. We started public Christian libraries because Christian literature was basically forbidden, but we also had literature on how to have better families. We brought in books, reference books that were not available before, very limited. I know that in terms of magazines that came in, the first time I was in Hungary, I found out that they would permit a couple kinds of books. It happened that National Geographic was one, but all kinds of books and all kinds of magazines were forbidden, and we were always checked on those if we crossed into those borders. So we started public libraries, and we also work on literacy in regard to that and help people.
Great, thank you. And how many check out Open Door Library's website for more information. And now, Greer, you have been working both with Goodwill Industries as well as with Global. And tell us a little bit about how people can learn more about Global and access this What is Justice series.
Certainly. Well, Global is such a unique organization, and as we're talking about the changing economy, as Randall mentioned, and how people are employing themselves or accessing information in this era, one of the great parts about global justice is that we're able to connect people from all over the country, from all different states and the globe. And the internet is such an amazing tool to do that. So I encourage everyone to check out all the features of our websites, as we're constantly posting new content and summarizing current events. It's a great source for staying in the loop with fellow believers and learning more about the concepts of biblical justice and how they're applying to each and every event day by day. As we go through and post events about the news. You can also connect through social media. We have a Facebook page, and you'll see updates and announcements. So the next roundtable discussion like this will be posted, and people will be able to join in live, and we encourage questions and interaction. And we really hope that as we begin to have events and seminars, hopefully maybe starting this summer, that we would have people from all over coming together, not just online, but at the events as we start to reach out and support other nonprofit organizations to really implement and serve and love those that are seeking justice all across every sector.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Randall Margo, Willard Black, and Greer Newman for joining us in this conversation today. And to our audience, we hope you'll return again in February when we do our next monthly roundtable discussion, bringing together community leaders from across generations and across sectors to discuss biblical justice. Thank you for joining us today. God bless you.